Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Mustafa bin Nifard. I'm a faculty in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia. And we are back with another session in the Ali Reza Ahmadian Lectures in Iranian and Persian Age Studies today. Before anything, I would like to acknowledge that although we are gathering virtually, UBC Vancouver is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And we are grateful for all of the resources on these lands from which we have been using in the past and currently. I would also like to mention that our thoughts are especially with the Iranians who are mourning the heart-wrenching death and loss of their loved ones due to the recent tragic building collapse in Abadan, Iran. We know that some are still desperately asking for help. We hope that they will be able to get the help they are entitled to. Today, we are hosting two dear guests, Dr. Marta Simidchieva and Dr. Nadeem Akhtar. Before going on with introducing our presenter and our discussant, I would like to mention a few preliminary points, as I usually do. I would like to give a big thank you again to my own team of Connie, An, Nazgul, and also thank Dr. Farzana Kermani-Nejad for his great poster designs. I would also like to remind you that we are providing closed captioning for those who might need it. You will be able to use this service by clicking on the live transcript at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And finally, if you have any questions, feel free to write them down in the chat box and in the Q&A section, which is going to be after the discussion between our presenter and discussant. Hopefully we'll have a chance for you to receive your responses. And with that said, I would like to introduce both the presenter and the discussant. Today's presenter, Dr. Marta Simidchieva, has a PhD in Iranian Studies from the Institute of Oriental Studies, Russian Academy of Sciences, Moscow, and a BA in English Literature from the University of Tehran, Iran, where she started her graduate work in Iranian Studies. She teaches courses on Islamic culture, religion, and civilization at the Department of Humanities, York University, Toronto. Her research interests lie in the domain of Persian literature, focusing on issues of continuity and change, modernity and tradition, literary reception, and East-West cultural interaction. Today's discussant, Dr. Nadeem Akhtar, obtained his PhD in Persian literature from Center of Persian and Central Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, having worked on the characters of the novels of Sadeq Hedayat, a prominent Iranian novelist. Dr. Akhtar has authored a book titled Hidayat in India in Persian, which has been published by Cheshme Publication in Tehran, Iran. He has also written various research articles and reports for journals and magazines published in India and abroad, including an entry in the Encyclopedia Iranica. He is a member of the Association of Iranian Studies and has presented his research articles in its biennial conferences held in Montreal and Vienna. Dr. Akhtar has also taught the Persian language in various summer schools organized for the students of George Washington University and Indian universities in the Institute of Indo-Persian Studies at Delhi, Kolkata, and Hyderabad, where he serves also as a joint secretary of the Institute. With that, I would like to invite Dr. Simidchieva to present her speech titled The Indian Connection in Hidayat's The Blind Owl. I'm sure that all of us know about the blind owl and also the mention of India and Indian things in it. but rarely, if ever, had researchers tried to bring to our attention some research details about this connection. And this is what Dr. Simidchieva is going to do for us, followed by a discussion with Dr. Nadeem Akhtar. Marta, thank you so much for accepting my invitation. It's a pleasure having you here, and we can't wait to hear what you have to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mustafa, and thank the whole team, Connie and Nosgol, and the author of the poster. It is a great honor and pleasure to be a part of the seminar of Iranian and Indo-Persian studies at UBC University. It is also somewhat intimidating because all of the speakers so far, which I have seen participating in the audience, have set a very high standard of scholarship. So it is not easy to measure up. Let me share my screen. And introduce a small change in the title of my lecture. It is the Indian connection in an allegorical reading of Sadeq Hedayat's Blind Owl. I'm emphasizing this because actually the topic of this talk is rather narrow. It is also something of a diversion from the general body of my research on this book, which has fascinated me since my student years and on which I have been working for a while. In general, my research is on the broad references to the Persian classical heritage tradition, to Persian classical heritage and tradition in this modernist novel. The scope of the present talk is rather narrow. It looks at the implicit and explicit references to India and things Indian, and the idea of India, in the emergence and its role in the emergence of modern Iranian literary culture. So the paper will not be addressing references to Hindu and Buddhist doctrines. These are topics which have been addressed by other researchers before. Nor does it claim that the interpretation I will present is the only possible one. Like the pieces in a kaleidoscope, the significant details of this novel fall in different patterns with every turn of the tube. So meaning takes place in the eye of the beholder. And there are so many interpretations of this novel, and probably many more will emerge further on. Now, before I address the topic, I was thinking that perhaps I should give a few details about Hedayat's biography. Probably most people in our audience know who he is, but there might be some who are coming from other fields. Sadeq Hedayat came from an influential and highly cultured family. Passion for Persian literature ran in their bloodline. Among his ancestors were the 14th century Sufi poet Kamal Khojandi, who was a contemporary of Hafez, and the Qajar era literary historian Reza Qolihan Hidayat, who wrote 2 major compendiums of biographies of the poets with more than 1,000 names and biographies in them. Reza Qolihan Hidayat was also a modernist, an early modernist, or modernizer rather, who became the dean of the first polytechnic in Iran, Darul Funun. Sadeq Hedayat, his descendant, was enrolled in that school too, but dropped out due to illness and was transferred to the French missionary school, St. Louis in Tehran. This college gave him proficiency in French and the window on world literatures in French translations. In 1925, Hedayat was sent on a state scholarship to continue his education in Belgium, then succeeded in transferring it to France. His stay there did not yield a degree, but Interwar Paris in particular was a cosmopolitan hub where writers and artists from across the world mixed, mingled, and experimented at a critical distance from the strictures of their home environment. Abroad, Hedayat wrote some of his early short stories and other works, which he published later when he returned to Iran. It is possible also that he wrote The Blind Owl while still in France, according to Mustafa Farzoneh, who knew him there and wrote a book about their friendship. But this is a question on which there is no consensus among scholars of Iranian studies. In 1930, Hedayat gave up his scholarship and returned to Iran. There he earned his living at a string of boring clerical jobs, but was in his element among the young literati who, like him, preached and practiced cultural reform in their writings. His sharp pen got him in trouble with the censor more than once, until in 1935, he was banned from publishing altogether. Luckily, the Iranian vice consul in Bombay, who was his friend and fellow writer, invited him to visit. Hedayat jumped at the chance to experience India firsthand. He has had an affinity to the country for a long time, and to study Middle Persian, Pahlavi, with scholars from the large Zoroastrian community in Bombay. In collaboration with his tutor, the eminent Parsi scholar Bahrampur Anklasaria, he translated into Persian for the first time Pahlavi works and Zoroastrian treatises from the early Islamic period in particular. He also wrote a number of other works, particularly 2 short stories in French, located in India. And through their analysis, our discussant, Nadeem Akhtar, located the lodgings of Hedayat in Bombay and traced his travels in the Indian subcontinent. Hedayat published The Blind Owl for the first time in Bombay in 50 handwritten stenciled copies, which he sent to friends residing outside of Iran because his publications were banned in the country. That much we know for sure. So there is still a debate where most of the novel was written. It is a short novel, about 70 normal pages, 125, pocket-sized pages. But the writings about it, the translations, are considerably more than its very modest size. I had not thought much about where the book was written at the beginning until the conference on Hedayat in Mumbai, organized by Professor Syed Akhtar Hussain from the University of Delhi. There, I heard the presentation of Nadeem about the short story Lunatic in particular, through which he found the lodgings of Hedayat, and it set me thinking. If Hedayat paid such a close attention to the settings in Bombay, why has he not done so to Benares, the Indian city in which part of the story is located? Perhaps because the 2 short stories reflect his lived experience in India, while The Blind Owl is based on refracted knowledge from his considerable readings about the country. For my own long-term project, The exact date of the novel's composition is not essential. So the blind owl will have a lot more interpretation because, like a mirror, it reflects back to the person who reads it whatever they have wrote before it. I brought to it a PhD in classical Persian literature. So I saw references to the classics at every turn. This made me look at the blind owl as a parable of cultural reform, which shows how there was a transition between classical and modern literature, and in a way legitimizes literary modernity as true successor of Iranian antiquity and the Persian classics. Now, before I go further, I think it might be useful to give a short summary of the novel. The Blind Owl is a first-person narrative in two parts, whose narrator appears in two guises and in two different settings. The two parts are held together by a single narrative voice which does not change, and by a curious structural loop through which the introduction and the conclusion hold the two parts together. In the introduction, the narrator contemplates a traumatic event from his past, which prompted him to examine his life through writing. In part one, he presents himself as a painter of papier-mâché pen cases who always reproduces the same classical scene. It depicts an old man dressed like an Indian yogi who is sitting under the cypress tree, and before him, across the stream, a young woman holds out a flower to the old man. The flower could be either a lotus or a blue morning glory. The Persian word is nilufare obi. One day on Sizdabedar, the 13th day after the Iranian New Year, an old man in Indian attire suddenly enters the painter's room. He might be his uncle, a trader in India. To treat the guest, the painter goes into the dark closet behind his room to get a bottle of wine left to him by his parents. Reaching up for it, he suddenly glimpses through a hole in the wall the living prototype of the scene which he has always painted. The ethereal beauty of the girl fills him with loathing for his tilted renditions of her. So he abandons his craft and searches for her in vain, until one night she herself comes to his doorstep and lies on his bed. Impulsively, the painter pours a sip of his inherited wine between her lips, but sees that she has turned into a corpse, cold and long dead. After a hopeless attempt to revive her with the heat of his own body, he tries to preserve her features in a painting. However, her magical glance eludes him. He captures it only after the corpse comes to life for an instant and opens her eyes. Having captured the essence of the girl in the portrait, the painter does not need the decaying body anymore. He dismembers it, packs it into a suitcase, and readies it for burial. Suddenly, an old gravedigger appears and takes him in his shears to a secluded place near the shrine Shabdolazim. While digging the girl's grave, the old man unearths a clay pot from the ancient city of Ray and gives it to the painter. Back at home, the painter discovers on the pot a picture of a woman which matches exactly his portrait of the ethereal girl. Struck by his kinship with the ancient artist, the painter sits by his charcoal burner and sings in an opium dream. The narrator awakes covered in blood in the world of part 2. He fears arrest and wants to forestall it with a drink of the poisoned wine left to him by his mother, an Indian dancer. But first, he wants to examine his tormented life in writing. The writer, as I will call him from here on, is a sick young man married to a faithless woman. She denies him all conjugal intimacy. He calls her la cote, the harlot or the bitch. Presumably, she has many lovers. Among them is an old Quran reader, a peddler of useless old wares, who has his spread across the street from their house. On this spread is a clay pot and a knife, which will end up in the hands of the writer. Tormented by hopeless desire for his wife's body, but barred from her room, the writer contemplates killing her. One night, he takes the knife, disguises himself as the old peddler, who is his wife's lover, and finally is welcomed into her bed. In the heat of passion, she bites his lip, and he inadvertently sticks her knife into her. Terrified by her cry, the writer runs back to his room, only to discover in the mirror that he has turned into the old man. The epilogue finds the narrator sitting again by the charcoal burner, as in part one, while the old man scuttles away, clutching the ancient clay pot under his arm. So to me, the stories of the painter from part one and the writer from part two represent two visions about the origin of the creative impulse: classical inspiration and Freudian sublimation. The plot line in part one also references the cultural debates in Iran at the time. Does the painter's crude renditions of the same classical scene echo the reformist contention that traditional art is just a mindless reproduction of outdated models? Similarly, the dismemberment of the dead ethereal girl references the destruction of the traditional art form, while its essence finds another medium of expression. Now, how does India fit in this parable? You can see it here highlighted in orange. First, the historical allusions to Indo-Iranian cultural context and patterns of migration seem to be reflected quite accurately, although not directly, in the Blind Owl. Between the 13th and the 18th century, economic migration generally flowed from Persia towards India. It was especially pronounced during the Safavid era, from the 16th to the 18th century, when many Persian administrators and poets found generous patrons in Mughal courts. In Mughal India, their works, according to Richard Eaton, were associated, and I quote, with prestige and cosmopolitanism, and were very highly valued. In Persia, though, from the 18th century on, and especially during the period of nation formation under the Qajars, so 18th and early 20th century, early 20th century, a backlash developed against this Indian style. Iranian literati decried the decadence of this art and actually called it mediocre poetic craft. They also called for a return or bozgasht to the style of Khorasan and Iraq, which was developed during the classical period of Persian culture between 10th and the 15th century. These trends seem to be reflected indirectly in the Blind Owl. The economic migration from Persia to India is replicated in part two by the trip of the narrator's father and uncle from the city of Ray to India, where they intend to trade in Iranian wares. In part one, India is the market for the painter's pen cases, just as it was for the works of the Persian men of the pen in Safavid times. And as with the work in the Indian style, his paintings are valued in India, but after his vision of the ancient archetype, they seem crude and stilted to him. At the end of the 18th century, with the emergence of the Qajar dynasty in Persia and the consolidation of British control in India, the cultural cross-currents changed direction once again. Now they were flowing from India to Persia. According to Mansour Bonagdarian, through the British presence, India had direct exposure to the latest developments in the Western world. Some novelties, like the printing press, were introduced first to India, and they were spread further from there rather than directly from the West. In the 19th and early 20th century, a well-established Iranian diaspora was a major factor of India's intellectual and political impact on Persia. For example, one of the earliest pro-reformist Persian weeklies, Qabl al-Matin, founded in Calcutta in 1893 by an Iranian emigre, played an active part in forming public opinion in Iran during the constitutional revolution of 1905-1911. India was also a major gateway through which nationalist and nativist ideas, especially regarding the Aryan origins of the Iranians, entered the Persian cultural space. According to Mansour Bonagdarian, some of them were transmitted through Iranian translations into Persian of Western works about the Indo-Europeans. But according to Muhammad Tabakuli Tarki, treatises by Indian Parsi authors on the glories of the pre-Islamic Persia and its Zoroastrian heritage had a significant role to play in the formation of Iranian national consciousness. It was also a factor in, and I'm quoting here, Iran-centered histories being displaced by displacing the dynastic and Islamic-centered chronicles. So Iran-centered histories displace dynastic chronicles and Islam-centered chronicles. This second phase in the Indo-Iranian exchanges might have found expression in part one of The Blind Owl through the visit of the uncle from India, which serves as the inception of the plot. This old man has an Indian shalmeh on his head and a ragged yellow cloak on his back. His visit sends the painter in search of his heritage, the inherited wine, and indirectly sets the stage for his vision of the archetype of his paintings, which changed his outlook on art and leads to the destruction of the antiquated forms of it, the decaying corpse. Thus, the uncle visit could be seen as a reference to the role of the Iranian diaspora in the inception of Iranian modernity, Iranian diaspora in India. Part one only implies a key role that India played in the painter's transformation from a craftsman into an inspired artist. In part two, Hedayat projects onto it the Freudian version of the parable of creativity. The Bugam Dasi story places the narrator's birth in India, the land of Indo-European origins. It also locates there the source of the writer's neurosis and his sexual inhibitions, which actually impel him to write. So here is the plot of this story. After emigrating to India with his twin brother, the writer's father falls in love with Bugam Dasi, a virginal dancer at the Lingam temple in Benares. He seduces her, she gets pregnant, and is cast out of the temple. The two marry, and when the baby is born, the father's twin visits Benares. he falls in love with Bugandasi and uses his resemblance to her husband to take advantage of her. Discovering the deception, Bugandasi demands that the two men undergo Cobra trial. Only one of them emerges alive from the terrifying ordeal. He is deranged and prematurely aged and has no recollection of the child, so they presume that he is the baby's uncle. Eventually, the boy is taken to the city of Ray in Iran and left in the care of his paternal aunt. The only legacy which his Indian mother leaves for him is a bottle of wine mixed with the poison of the cobra that killed his father. The writer still thinks of her, dancing somewhere in India for the crowds while her husband watches on. In the Bugandasi story, Hedayat weaves some well-known features of Hinduism. He locates it in the story in Benares, the holiest of the ancient cities of India. In this city is the most important temple of Shiva, the supreme god in Shaivism, one of the traditions of Hinduism. The lingam represented here in the center is Shiva's aniconic manifestation. It is a phallic object which symbolizes the generative power of the god and his supreme status vis-a-vis other Hindu deities. Shiva is also known as Nataraja, Lord of the dance or Lord of the dancers. And that manifestation is represented in the statue here on top. His cosmic dance symbolizes the continuous cycle of creation and destruction of the universe. The primal forces associated with the dance of Shiva find expression in the timeless, dangerous, irresistible erotic allure of Bugandasi's dance, which is described by Hedayat. Her name derives from Devadasi, Sanskrit from female servant of God. It is a designation of hereditary Indian temple dances. According to some sources, Devadasis were women dedicated as children to the service of a god through a marriage ritual which bars them from marrying a human partner. That is why in the novel, Bugandasi should remain a virgin. However, according to other sources, for example, Amrit Srinivasan, when Devadasis reach puberty, they may enter into sexual relations with a temple patron from a higher caste, but are not allowed to get involved with men from another religion or from a lower caste. The name Bugam has long puzzled Iranists until Nadeem discovered that it is used by temple dancers in the southeast of India. So Bugam may be derivative of Bogam, a Telugu word for embodiment of enjoyment, a name which is given to a class of women in southern India who, according to Davesh Soneji, are associated with non-normative sexuality. The character of Bugandasi embodies the mystique and the erotic aura of such women, along with the danger inherent in the arousal of unchecked libidinal forces. Her sensuous dance incites men to transgression and may bring about their downfall through madness or death. The role of the old man in The Blind Owl is expanded through his many incarnations. He appears at critical junctures in both parts of the plot, in the guise of the old gravedigger in part 1 and the old peddler in part 2. He is associated with Islamic Iran. Other incarnations are linked to Indian, mainly through his clothing. In the painter's vision of part 1, he is dressed as an Indian yogi. As the painter's visitor or uncle, he wears an Indian turban and a yellow coat, the color associated with God Vishnu, which signifies both knowledge and sexual prowess. Sometimes the old man acts as a guide to the narrator. The old grave digger in part 1 hands over to the painter the ancient clay pot from Ray, which proves his connection to the artists of the past. More often, though, when the old man appears in Islamic garb, he functions as a Freudian father figure who either inhibits the sexual impulses of the young man or is his rival in love. In part 2, the sinister laughter of the old man, the father of the bitch, interrupts the kiss which his daughter and the narrator share before they get married. As the old peddler, he is the lover of the narrator's wife, while her hapless husband yearns in vain for her body. When dressed in a yellow coat, the figure of the old man seems to represent the primordial urges of the flesh, hidden deep in the subconscious and straining to be released. For example, in part 2, the yellow coat is wrapped around the narrator's own shoulders. He puts it on when he prepares to enter the room of his wife. Although he is trying to disguise himself as her presumed lover, the old Quran reciter and peddler, the yellow coat links him to the sexually charged Indian incarnations of the old man. In Hedayat's parable, Islam is the restrictive, regulating principle of social mores, co-equal with the superego in Freudian psychoanalysis, while Hindu mythology is perceived as duly recognizing the constructive and destructive power of the libidinal force, the realm of the id. The cobra is another iconic Indian image evoked repeatedly in the Freudian version of the parable. It appears first in the cobra trial of the Bugamdasi story. Then it surfaces again and again in different contexts pertaining to carnal desire. We see it as a metaphor for the irresistible force and mortal danger of sexuality in the cobra-like movements of Bugamdasi's dance. It is in the embrace of the writer's wife during their only sexual encounter, when her body, and I quote, enclosed him within itself like a cobra coiling around its prey. And after her murder, the narrator leaves her room suddenly aged, like a man who has emerged alive from a room where he was shut up with a cobra. Women are not immune from snake nightmares either. Thus, left alone in the bridal chamber with her new husband, the writer's wife trembles like a willow, as if closed in a dungeon with a dragon. This was a quote at the end. At some point, the writer also mentions that she would rather be with an Indian snake than with him. Apparently for her, the great snake is an emblem of terror and loathing associated with an unwanted sexual act. In general, the cobra plays a key role in the Freudian parable of creativity, but it is exclusively associated with the temptations and mortal perils of sexuality. In Hinduism, Nagas and Naginis, male and female cobras, have a much broader range of functions and a deep mythological significance. They are symbols of rebirth because of the way that they change their skin and shed their skin. They're also guardians of springs and rivers. They're primordial beings, and some of them, like Shesha, the thousand-headed snake, who supports the earth on his hooves, are part of the cycle of creation and destruction. Shesha, which is a Sanskrit for the one who remains, is the only being that remains intact when the world is destroyed. And it is on him, swimming in the ocean of bliss, that God Vishnu, the preserver, reclines between the bouts of destruction and creation of the universe. Shesha's younger brother Vasuki is the snake born as a garland around Shiva's neck. This is his reward for allowing to be coiled around Mount Mandara by the Devas and the Asuras, who churned with him the milky ocean creating the ambrosia of immortality. Now, none of these mythological functions of the Cobra feature in Hedayat's novel. The trial by Cobra seems to be the main direct allusion to Hindu mythology, since torture by snakebite is one of the torments of hell in the Garuda Purana, as Nadeem has pointed out. Probably someone who knows Hindu mythology better will see other references, but to me, the snake references, especially the indirect snake references in the Blind Owl, are closer in significance to the serpent from the Judeo-Christian tradition, who is the seducer of Adam and Eve, who entices them to eat of the forbidden fruit, to gain carnal knowledge, to be cast out of paradise, and to come to know shame, sin, and death. So, what conclusions can we draw from these observations about the Indian connection in the Blind Owl when read as an allegory of cultural reform? On the level of historical fact, the references to India and things Indian in part 1 reflect accurately the role of the Indian diaspora from the subcontinent in creating a reformist momentum in Iran. India as a land of origins and as a rich and ancient culture plays an important role in both versions of the parable, presenting the sources of the creative impulse. It seems to have been harnessed by Hedayat in paradigms of creativity, drawing on the theories of both Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. Hedayat draws here on the mysterious India, on India where the union of the male and the female transcends into a cosmic principle, where earthly desire and its fulfillment are openly celebrated in miniature, in sculpture, and in temple rituals. As a true modernist, Hedayat freely borrows from the treasures of this ancient culture and interweaves its symbols and images with the philosophical and aesthetic postulates of psychoanalysis to address topical issues in the Iranian cultural discourse. In the process, Hedayat's manifesto acknowledges the close kinship of Indians and Iranians and the contribution of India to Iranian modernity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marta, for this very insightful and interesting talk. At this point, I would like to invite Dr. Nadeem Akhtar. Nadeem, thank you very much for accepting my invitation and joining us despite the very early morning time in India right now. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Mustafa. And thanks very much to your team, Connie and Nazgul. And thank you, Marta, for your interesting and beautiful presentation. See, this Indian connection in Hidayat's Blind Owl is a very interesting and also a very important subject to study for many reasons. Some of it that Marta has mentioned, that firstly, Buffekur was printed in India, which became the masterpiece of modern Persian literature. And secondly, the narrative of the novel has Indian characters, places, objects, and traditions, which have been dexterously incorporated by Sadeq Hedayat in the novel. So I would like to briefly talk about Hidayat's journey to India, because it is very important to understand his time in India in order to understand the plot of the novel. See, there are multiple narratives about Hidayat's tryst with India. Some says that he came to India to learn Pahlavi language. Some says that he mainly came to India to publish Buffekur, as he was deterred from publishing books in his country. Some says that he had keen interest in Buddhism and vegetarianism, which attracted him to India. But these presumptions and assumptions do not explain explicitly about Hidayat's sojourn to India. Because they lack in authenticity and coherence to build an argument about Hidayat's sojourn to the country. And in such case, the only authentic source that somehow provides a clear picture of his stay in India are indeed his letters that he has written from Bombay to his friends Mustafa Minavi and Jan Ripka. Interestingly, his letters reveal that he had never planned to visit India. Instead, he wanted to go to Switzerland to meet his friend Sayyid Muhammad Ali Jamalzadeh. He was desperate to leave Iran because it was, for him, it was irksome and suffocating. But the only impediment to leave for Switzerland was that his passport and other travel documents were with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at Tehran. So without them, how could he enter Europe? It was very disappointing time for him. However, incidentally, Sheen Parto was deputed as an official of the Persian consulate at Bombay in India at that time. And he met Hidayat and persuaded him to travel to Bombay, where he would be an Iranian official at that consulate. So, and Hidayat writes about this to his friend Mustafa Minawi, and he writes that Dr. Parto be unwane murakhasi be Iran amad, az dehnash dar raf wo gof amadam tora ba khudam bebaram. Kur az khuda che mikhad, do chashme bina, digar velesh na kardam. And thus he reached Bombay in 1936, just to escape from the humdrum of life in Iran, which he has called Gandistan. So as far as if we talk about the publication of Buffekur and influence of India in the novel, some scholars believe that Hidayat wrote the novel in 1937, while others maintain that he wrote the masterpiece long ago when he was in Paris in 1920s. However, it is hard to accept, at least for me, that he already had a copy of the novel in 1920, because if he had finished it in 1920, the novel would have been published much before he had visited India. And one of the authentic sources to know Hidayat are his letters, and his letters are silent with regard to the writing of Buffekur during his stay in France in 1920s and 30s. But his letters written during his stay in Bombay speak volumes of the publication of his works, particularly Buffekur. And moreover, if he had written Buffekur in 1920 or 25, he would not have waited for 16 long years to publish the novel from Bombay, as mostly all his works were published immediately after he had written them. So Hidayat arrived in Bombay in December 1936, and Buffekur was ready for publication on 12th February 1937. If someone believes that Hidayat started writing the novel in India, in that case, Hidayat must have written the novel in 60 days. Since the exact date of the publication of the novel is known to us, so it was improbable that India would so deeply impact Hidayat in his short sojourn to India and directly influence on the novel. In fact, Hidayat partially saw the country and had visited South and West India after the publication of Buffekur. And he represented the two parts of India, namely Bangalore and Bombay, in his two short stories, that is Lunatic and Sampinge. So these two short stories show the direct Indian influence on Hidayat rather than the Buffekur. And one has to agree with Marta that Hidayat had a prior knowledge of India, which he had gained from the works of French Orientalists to appropriate it to Buffekur. For example, in the Vegetarianism, when he wrote Vegetarianism, and it was one of his first works, Hidayat referred to the Postman of India, which he derived from the works of Professor Lefebvre. But until now, no cohesive study has been made to establish the Indian linkages with the Buffekur of Hidayat. It is still a mystery about Hidayat's acquaintance with India with regard to Devdasi tradition, Shiva, Lingam temple, Banaras, and many other prominent Indian motifs. But to solve this mystery, one can look up the book titled India. It was written by a French traveler, Pierre Loti. Please excuse my pronunciation. He was a French naval officer who had visited India in 1899, and he published his account in 1903 or 1902. He traveled from south to north and recorded minute descriptions of the country, particularly the temples of Shiva and Vishnu and the dancing girls in his book. And when he reached Pondicherry, that was a European colony at that time, his host had organized a dance performance of a Devdasi girl that she was called from a Shiva temple to perform before him. In his book, he had recorded the event in the section titled The Dance of Bayadere. Bayadere is a French word for Devdasi. And once a person compares the description of dancing girls recorded by Loti in the book with Hidayat's Bogam Dasi in Buffekur, he would be convinced to find their close similarity. like the ornamental details of the temple dancer, her dancing movements, like scantily clothed people in the gatherings, the dancing movement like a cobra snake, are all similar to Hidayat's depiction of Bogam Dasi in Bufekur. Apart from it, one important thing is that the word lingam temple that was used by Hidayat in the novel, it is hardly used in India for a Shiva temple. There has no such temple in India by the name of Lingam temple. It is a Shiva temple, which is marked by the presence of a phallus or lingam in it. It is again Loti who used the word Lingam temple in his French travelogue. Similarly, the words like Jogi, morning glory, and several other Indian motifs present in the account of Loti are found to influence Hidayat to incorporate them into the narrative of Bufekur. And the most important, Loti has also written a separate chapter on Banaras, where he gave accurate description of Hindu religion and yogis and sadhus and Hindu priests of the city. So it is quite clear that Hidayat knew about the Devdasis or the dancing girls before he came to India. Because when he arrived at Bombay, he wanted to visit the places to see the Indian dances, which he minutely observed. He used to observe the physical appearance of the prostitutes of the city, and he expressed them in these words like the black Indian prostitute who wears rings in her nose and ear, wears armlets, toe rings, and anklets. She untangles her dress slowly and surrenders her black body like Venus Noir. So undoubtedly, some of the description of India in Bufekur given by Hidayat owe to the book India of Pierre Loti. Moreover, having visited Bombay and observed the sex workers of the city at night, Hidayat seemed to have incorporated their details and description in the Bufekur. And one can give benefit of doubt to scholars who believe that Hidayat had written the novel during his visit to India. And other thing that I would like to discuss, because Marta, you have discussed about the Iranian migration to India in late 19th century. It is very important to know that Hidayat entered Bombay during the time when the Parsi population in India recorded its highest number. And the Great Persian Famine of 1869 or 1870 that took lives of some 12 millions or 2/3 of Iranian population, and many Zoroastrians of Yazd and Kerman migrated to Bombay to escape from the famine, and they settled in the city. So the city at that time witnessed a second wave of Iranian migration after the 7th century exodus. And the Parsis in the 18th and 19th century succeeded in their businesses, earned a tremendous amount of fortune and reputation, and they also lavishly spent their wealth in charity. They also rekindled their fire temple in India that was extinguished in the country of its origin. So the development of the Parsis in India appealed to their brethren back in Iran. They started migrating from Iran to Bombay in search of new opportunities and prosperity. So Hidayat, though he was not a Zoroastrian like other Iranians of the era, Hidayat had a desire to meet the Parsi community of India to explore the opportunities for himself. During the time Hidayat was in Bombay, the city was already filled with poor Parsis because they migrated from Iran to India to escape the famine and religious persecution by the Shiite Muslims of Iran. So the newly arrived followers of Zoroastrianism from Iran were called Irani, and they occupied themselves in various lucrative professions in the city. They excelled in culinary skill by selling teas and food at a small restaurant in the city. Some of the Iranis were even seen doing jobs as gardeners and domestic servants. However, they were living a respectful and peaceful life in Bombay as compared to Iran. So Hidayat witnessed the well-being of the Iranis who made a successful and a prosperous life in Bombay. So perhaps it was the reason that made Hidayat to think to start a business in India. And in his letters to Ripka, he requested to send him samples of new European products for ladies so that he can start a business in partnership with someone in Bombay. So I think apart from what Hidayat did in India and when Blind Owl was published, there were lots of things to say about Hidayat in India. So thank you, Marta. Thank you very much for this presentation. And once again, I am thankful to Mustafa and your team for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nadeem. Marta, would you like to mention anything? Sorry, Marta, I think you're muted. You're still muted.
Thank you very much, Nadeem. Very fascinating insights about Hedayat's life in India. With regard to whether he would have published immediately The Blind Owl, there is a precedent of him publishing very late something that he wrote early, and that is Afsaneya of Arinesh, which he wrote in France, and which he published, which he sent, he wrote it in France during his first stay there. And since this was a tricky subject, he actually made a puppet play out of the story of creation. He sent it considerably later, I think in the 40s it was, I don't remember the exact date, but he sent it years later to be published in France, and not under his own name. So if something was sensitive, like well, in The Blind Owl, there are places where he's not very, very considerate in remarks about Islam. He might have held it back. But as you say, there is no way of knowing when exactly it was all written. It seems clear. Well, the very use of Bugam Dasi suggests that even if it was written earlier, he certainly polished it, added to it when he was in India. So even, the use of this term suggests that he had, as you say, actually here, if I can share the screen for a moment again, and this one shows Telugu is spoken here, as you can see, in the southeast, and here is Benares or Varanasi. So the distance is quite significant, as you said. He was traveling in the south of India, and obviously, Bugam was not something that very many people knew about. So you are right that he probably added that later on. And I just want to show the dasis and the dancing girls who were all the rage in Europe, actually. There are a number of photos of them. If you go into Victoria and Albert Museum, photos from the 19th century until the time when Hedayat himself was around. Europe, there was Indomania in Europe from, well, the 18th until the 20th century, actually, mid-20th century. But yeah, so he could have also heard about some of those things beforehand. But I think that your research there is truly interesting and unique, and it will add significantly to our understanding of Hedayat and knowledge of Hedayat. Especially, with your following of leads on the ground and adding very concrete details to hypotheses that we form on the basis of his text. So in order to be sure, we have to, if we can, we have to have solid other evidence, something that he has mentioned as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, why I'm saying that, why I sometimes believe that Hidayat started writing Blind Owl in India is that, you said that he wrote Afrinash with which book, which stories, Marta, you were talking about?
Afsaneya Afrinash. Yeah,
Afsaneya Afrinash he wrote
story of
during the time when he was in Paris, right?
Mm-hmm.
But maybe it was published later in 1945 or 46, but you will find the name of Afsaneya Afrinash in his letters throughout that time, that he is doing some editing in that. He has sent the Afsaneya Afrinash to someone. I'm waiting for something. So there was something about Afsaneya Afrinash available in his letters. But as far as Blind Owl is concerned, I can't find like the letters that he has written while he was in Paris or before he was in India. I can't find any traces of Blind Owl in his letters. Anyways, that letters cannot be the only source, and from that we cannot conclude that he has not written novel in Paris. But certainly he had all the knowledge of Bogamdasi and Banaras in advance when he was in Paris. We cannot say that he came to India and he traveled to Banaras or he saw Devdasi in any temple, then he incorporated those things in the novel.
Yeah, you're right. Also, it is impossible to say whether he wrote it in Paris or wrote it, worked on it later on. It is such a rich work that he could have, but I just thought that he probably finished it in general outlines, not in all the details. I thought he might have finished it before he came to India, so whether in Paris or altogether. But again, this is a discussion which scholars of Hedayat have been having for a very long time.
Yes, but that is certain that, see, Hidayat came to Bombay in last week of December 1936. And the novel he published was 12th of February 1937. So it's up to the scholars whether they can say that Hidayat can write a novel, fresh novel in 60 days. I don't know. Because at the time when he was in Bombay, he was running pillar to post to find opportunities. And he was looking for some jobs. He wanted to open a shop there, and he wanted to get married in Bombay. So fine, he was quite busy in personal affairs. But anyway, it's very difficult to conclude whether he started writing Blind Owl in Bombay or he was carrying the novel with him.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Fascinating discoveries.
Thank you very much to both of you. So, Marta, are we expecting like a publication on this presentation in the future, hopefully?
Yes, why not?
As I said, this is a sideline altogether. My central attention is on Hedayat and references to the Persian classics, and actually Shiism and Zoroastrianism, all of that is in the mix as well. So I started with looking at implicit references to Manuchehri and Visoramin, and what else? Yeah, maybe those two, and then Zoroastrianism, Zoroastrian mythology, and lately one on Shiism, actually Suhrawardi, and so on. So all sorts of things start coming out once you, as I said, the whole project is in a way takes as a model Michael Beard's Hedayat's Blind Owl as a Western novel, and is jawab to it, is nazire to it. So Michael Beard provides the model that I use, but look at other things. So, just like Nezami would say, oh, Ferdowsi spoke about this, but he didn't quite pay attention to these little things. So it is something like that. So it looks different. It is fascinating how malleable the blind owl is. Whatever you bring to it, it reflects back. If you come as a comparativist, you will see, as Michael Beard saw, references to Western literature, right? Bashiri saw references to Hinduism.
Buddhism.
Maybe, and Buddhism as well, yeah. And, there is I don't have it at hand now, but there is a quote from the Blind Owl where, oh, thank you, Ostat, where Hedayat, well, the narrator in the Blind Owl says that all the stories he has read, all the narratives he has heard just come out through him, but they're and take shape in the masks on his face in a way. So his learning seems to be very broad. It might not have been academic learning, but he really read broadly, and all of those bits and pieces form startling new texts, which this is world literature in two ways, both by his openness to the world and the effect which his literature has on the world.
Very good, and thank you, Marta. And I should also apologize because at one point during your response, I was distracted for a moment. I had a visitor coming in the room, so I had to just turn off my screen and microphone for a moment. We have also a few questions, and I also encourage the audience, if they have any questions, now is the time, please, to submit them. So we have some pre-submitted questions. Also, we have a couple of questions here in the session. Mahine Nasiri submitted a question, and they are asking, from mythological perspective, from which you are reading the book, how do you explain and justify such a bitter view Hidayat expresses towards human beings, men and women, and the world? So there is, of course, this assumption in the question. I guess there are two questions for you, right? Do you agree that Hidayat has such a bitter view toward humanity? And also, if yes, how would you explain that with the methodology that you used to analyze the Indian connections and the novella?
Bitter views. This is very, very typical of some of the modernist literature, where the narrator is alienated. And in that respect, it fits that that template. This is used also for critiquing the circumstances in which he lives. But whether it is, well, he calls the masses Raja-Leho in this case, sees them as, in a way, interested only in material things, in sex and in their belly. But again, alienation is one of the landmarks of this type of literature again. Maybe Nadeem has something to say about that.
No, please, Marta, go ahead.
Well, not all of it is bitter. The ethereal girl is so
exactly. It's just contrary to what the Jale is.
It's elevated. Also, the beauty of this book is that we don't really know what happens, right? We're in the head of an unreliable narrator who himself doesn't know what is going on, right? He changes his view, he forgets, time has no meaning for him and so on. So it is fascinating, and that's why we go back to it again and again, I think.
Thank you, Marta. One of the questions that was submitted upon registration, and sorry, just let me check here. Someone is asking Pratima Sharma, what is the significance of morning glory in the novel? And I know this is like opening a can of worms, of course, when it comes to the interpretation of. But if you could briefly maybe mention something about maybe the multiplicity of interpretations.
Well, the very word is ambiguous. Nilufare Obi, is it the blue morning glory, or is it a lotus, Nilufar, which grows on water? I think the ambiguity might be intentional. The Nilufar shows itself primarily on dry land. It covers the grave of the ethereal girl. It grows through all of those houses, strange houses that the narrator encounters when the gravedigger drives him to the gravesite. So probably it is a morning glory. One of the theories, just think of the scene which the painter sees through the hall. There is an old man sitting under a tree, biting his finger. there is a stream between him and the girl who is giving him a morning glory. He doesn't take it. He's biting his finger. What is the significance of this tableau, so to speak? What is the shape of the morning glory? Have you heard of the term deflower? Perhaps she's offering the flower which he cannot take. Perhaps this is an indication of his inability, his impotence actually to engage with her. Also in the second part of the story, we have his word that I mentioned several times, presumably lascivious wife. We have his word for it that she's running around and having lovers of all kinds. At one point, he says, maybe he is still a virgin. So we don't even know that. So one of the meanings of the morning, one of the significances of the morning glory might be, part of this Freudian framework. The other is the ambiguity which the Indian context brings, because the lotus is a sacred flower there, right? It has something to do, well, I don't know Indian Hindu mythology and Buddhist mythology well enough, but in one of the creation and destruction of the world, as Lord Vishnu lies over Shesha, this snake with 1,000 heads, lotus flower is growing out of his navel, and in it is Brahma, right? Another divinity, which is a creator. So someone who knows Indian mythology much better than I probably can interpret it in that line of thought.
Oh, that was pretty much comprehensive, Marta. Thank you very much. When we discuss the blind owl in my modern Persian literature course, right at the beginning, we start with, I give my students like the terms by Roland Barthes, the French critic, right, of readerly and writerly texts. And I say, which one do you think? And I give them the definitions, and I think, which one do you think, the blind owl falls into? Is it a readerly text or is it a writerly text? And for those who might not be familiar with the terms, the readerly text would be more on the sort of passive reception side, where you read and enjoy a text, and pretty much it's what it says or what it intends to say, and almost everybody has the same sort of reception, whereas the writerly text is a type of text which encourages you, maybe even forces you to participate in the creative process with the writer. So you, in your own turn, as a reader, become a writer by just trying to, get bits and pieces from here and there and put them together and recreate the text, right? And I think it really is a writerly text by, any stretch of imagination, because I myself have had many, and by the way, compared to you and Nadeem, I'm definitely not an expert on Hedayat at all, but just as an informed reader of the novella, I always think that I am getting certain things, or trying to, connect certain meanings, only to prove, in a few pages later that, oh, it proved to be a mirage, it's a slipping out of my hands again, right? So it's fabulous how this text has been created. Anyway, just one more question, and it was just submitted by Noor Habib among our current audiences, and yes, I think we can close after this question. Is the last one. So Noor says, thanks for an amazing talk. This is a broad question, and maybe this is a question for both Nadeem and Marta, I guess. This is a broad question, but would you be able to comment on other types or examples of literary exchanges between Iran and India at the time? I think they are referring to the modern time, or was Hedayat the first and only literary figure, or maybe even artistic figure? Because we can think of people in cinema as well, right? To come to India for inspiration, right? So if you could briefly address that, I would be grateful.
I'll leave that to Nadeem, who...
Steve, first of all,
my
told you
focus is very narrow on the classics and Hedayat.
No, thank you for this question. I think that, see, Hidayat didn't come to India for inspirations. He never planned that I will go to India and I will take inspiration from India and I will write something. It was a coincidence that he traveled here. There were many writers who came to India, and after going back, he wrote something about India, like Saurabh Sapehri, if I am not wrong, isn't it? So I see, there are many. For example, Hafiz, he didn't come to India, but he wrote about India in his poem. We planned to come to India, but unfortunately it failed. But he wrote about India in his poem. So I don't think so any writer goes to any country for inspiration, except the travelers, isn't it? If Marta, you can add something on it.
Oh, probably. Well, if you go back, you can see so many poets going to India, maybe not for inspiration, but for remuneration, because the Mughals were very, very generous. But many of them really grew very fond of it as well. So, for example, well, there are also, when I read somewhere that the production of literature in Persian in India actually is much more numerous than the production of literary production in Persian in Iran, in present-day Iran. So this is a massive country, which for centuries had Persian as its language of culture and, of administration as well, until the 19th century when English replaced it. So there was a lot of movement of poets before that. And well, in the pre-modern period, of course. And I wouldn't, thinking of the hippies who went to India in droves in the 60s for inspiration. Probably there are poets galore in them, not only from, well, maybe not from Iran, I don't know, but definitely quite a few people have sought inspiration in India.
So thank you very much to all of, first of all, to Marta and Nadeem. If you have any final remarks, of course, I'll get back to you, and please do mention that. And in the meantime, I also want to thank very much all of the audiences that took the time to attend this lecture. I really appreciate their presence. Any final remarks, Nadeem and Marta, before we say goodbye? And of course, you've been generous enough to allow us to show your email addresses in case any of the audience members would like to, keep in touch if they have any follow-up questions. So thank you very much for doing that. There's also a survey which we always, offer to our audiences. So if you have time, a few minutes, would appreciate some feedback on your part so we can improve our work in the future. There's also, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, our last 2022 spring 2022 lecture, which is going to occur on June 19th, and it's going to feature my dear colleague at UBC, Dr. Hessam Dehqani, who will be accompanied by Mr. Mujib Mehdad from Kabul in Afghanistan. With that, again, let me go back to Marta and Nadeem if they have any final things to mention before saying goodbye.
I just want to thank very much the organizers and the audience for this, very welcoming session, which put us at ease and elicited quite a lot of interesting questions and topics. And I want to wish you success and long time to organize sessions like this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marta. It's been a pleasure, and we're really honored to have you. And Nadeem, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mustafa, for organizing this event and for this interesting subject and giving me opportunity for that. And I'm also thankful to all the attendees, and especially my Indian Indian friends who wake up at 4:30 for this talk. Thank you very much.
Of course, and yourself as well, Nadeem. We really feel honored and privileged to have you in this event. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you very much.
Connie and Nazgul, thank you so much as well. So for a short debrief session, we'll stay ourselves. Otherwise, everybody have a great rest of your day or night, wherever you are, and looking forward to seeing you later. Thank you. Bye-bye.